Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, July 17th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The House passes an $886 billion NDAA. So this was on Friday that the House passed its version of the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act. It passed in a vote of 219 to 210. And the vote fell along partisan lines due to amendments that were added by Republicans relating to social policies in the military. It was kind of strange watching the debate. It was like the culture wars being debated while they're making the NDAA. Because usually, this passes with very strong bipartisan support. But these Republican amendments cover things like abortion, transgender surgery, and diversity initiatives, all within the military. So only 4 Democrats voted in favor of the bill and 4 Republicans voted against it. The 4 Republicans who opposed the NDAA were Reps Thomas Massie from Kentucky, Eli Crane of Arizona, Andy Biggs of Arizona, and Ken Buck of Colorado. The Senate still needs to pass its version of the NDAA, and then the 2 chambers will negotiate the final version that will go to President Biden's desk. So this is usually a pretty long process, and now it might be even a little longer with these Republican amendments in the House version. It's going to set up a fight between the 2 chambers because the Senate is led by Democrats. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and other Democrats, are not going to want these amendments in there. So again, this is the NDAA. This is the annual military spending bill, and it's $886 billion, which is what President Biden asked for. That was his request. And now, as I've gone over before, if you want to look at the true total of military spending or spending on, national security or the empire, whatever you want to call it, adding other things like the Veteran Affairs Department and the Homeland Security and all sorts of other things, interest on debt. It's the true total is about $1.5 trillion when you factor those things in. But this is the bill, the spending bill that they pass every year for the Pentagon and for the other departments' military programs, like the Energy Department's nuclear weapons program. So again, $886 billion, what Biden asked for, that debt ceiling deal that was reached between House Republicans and the White House, it did not limit military spending. They gave Biden what he asked for. Although the previous 2 years, Congress gave Biden way more than he asked for the 2023 NDAA. Congress raised it by $45 billion more than Biden requested. So as the House was debating the NDAA, several amendments were introduced by Republicans looking to rein in U.S. support for Ukraine, and they were all voted down. I mentioned a few of these in the last show, but one of them that was interesting was from Warren Davidson. He's a Republican from Ohio. And his amendment would have required the Biden administration to develop a strategy for the war in Ukraine, which, doesn't that sound like a good idea to have a strategy when you're funding, a proxy war against the world's largest nuclear power? But no, that was rejected in a vote of 129 to 301. Only Republicans supported it. So no coherent strategy. Let's just, support this open-ended conflict for as long as we feel like it. And then the other amendments, there was one from Marjorie Taylor Greene that would have cut $300 million in military aid for Ukraine. That's in the NDAA. And that's separate from the way that they've been spending on the war in Ukraine is through emergency supplemental funds, is what they call them. The White House asked Congress to approve it. And again, that debt ceiling deal did not put any limit on that. So essentially, there's no caps on spending on Ukraine. But there is also $300 million in the NDAA for Ukraine. So Green wanted to cut that out of it, but that failed in a vote of 89 to 341. Matt Gaetz had an amendment to cut off all military assistance to Ukraine. That failed in a vote of 70 to 358. And then, of course, there was the amendment to block the U.S. cluster bomb shipments to Ukraine, and that got a little bit of Democrat support. 49 Democrats voted in favor and 98 Republicans voted in favor. but obviously it wasn't enough, so it failed in a vote of 147 to 276. Yeah, so we'll probably see the Senate is going to start working on their version later this month, and then we'll see what they end up, the final version is going to be. All right, the next one here, bipartisan bill would prevent any president from leaving NATO. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute, and this is a bill that was introduced in the Senate. A group of senators have reintroduced legislation to prevent an American president from withdrawing from the NATO alliance. A version of the bill failed to pass the legislature during the Trump administration. So Senators Tim Kaine, he's a Democrat from Virginia, and Marco Rubio, Republican from Florida, they're both members of the Foreign Relations Committee. They introduced this bill, and it had several co-sponsors as well. So this is, you have these senators that, they don't want Congress voting, to go to war or anything. They don't want to worry about that. They want Congress to prevent, the president from leaving this huge, entangling military alliance. So Kaine argued that the bill was needed because the war in Ukraine has exposed Russia's weakness. So a lot of that, rhetoric that NATO is stronger than ever, Russia's, on its heels. And it was also supported by Senators Richard Blumenthal, Democrat from Connecticut, Jerry Moran, Republican, Dianne Feinstein, Democrat, Ben Cardin, Democrat, August King, Independent, Amy Klobuchar, Democrat, Jeff Merkley, Democrat, and Dick Durbin, Democrat. So a lot of Democrats are, they're all about NATO now. All right. So the next one here, U.S. intelligence official says that the Ukraine war is a stalemate. So this is interesting. A senior Defense Intelligence Agency official has described the war in Ukraine as a stalemate and said that none of the weapons the U.S. and NATO are providing will help Ukrainian forces break through in their counteroffensive. So this is the DIA Chief of Staff, John Kirchhofer. He said this at a conference this past Thursday. I just saw it on Sunday. But he said, quote, certainly we are at a bit of a stalemate. One of the things that the Russian leadership believes is that they can outlast the support of the West, end quote. He listed some of the weapons that NATO recently began providing, including American cluster bombs and British Storm Shadow missiles. He said, quote, none of these, unfortunately, are the holy grail that Ukrainians are looking for that will allow them to break through, end quote. So essentially saying, this isn't going to be enough. This fighting is just, just going to drag on, but Ukraine's not going to regain any territory is what he's expecting. And Ukrainian forces have struggled to make much headway since launching their counteroffensive at the beginning of June. U.S. and European officials told the New York Times in a report that was published Saturday that 20% of all Ukraine's weaponry deployed to the battlefield was damaged or destroyed during just the first 2 weeks of that counteroffensive. The officials said that the rate of losses dropped to 10% in the ensuing weeks as Ukrainian forces were approaching Russian minefields more cautiously. In the beginning, they were just getting destroyed by all these mines that Russia planted. So what's interesting, is that these U.S. officials speaking to the Times, and, they didn't offer any kind of figures about how many Ukrainian lives have been expended in this counteroffensive. It seems like, Ukraine has kept a very tight lid. Both sides have kept a very tight lid on the number of casualties that they've suffered. And this seems to be just such a big propaganda ploy, because we're hearing about, they're losing all this equipment, armored vehicles. They're telling us that, but I guess they don't want to tell us how many people are dying, maybe because then Americans might not want to stomach this for much longer if they hear that, a few hundred Ukrainians are dying or, or getting wounded every day in this battle. So, yeah, and I also saw an interview with another one with Zaluzhny, who's the Ukrainian commander-in-chief in the Washington Post. And they said every day he receives casualty, he learns who died in the battle. He gets casualties, reports every day. And I guess they didn't think to ask him, can you tell us what they are? It didn't say in the interview, if he refused to say or if they asked him at all. So it's just strange. And, we know leading up to the counteroffensive, the Discord leaks, and there were media reports that revealed that the U.S. did not expect Ukraine to regain any significant territory in this counteroffensive. But the Biden administration pushed for it, and they, rejected the idea of a pause in fighting, of a ceasefire. No peace talks, just keep pouring weapons in and now pouring cluster bombs in that are going to just kill civilians. So the next one here, Putin says that Russia can use cluster bombs in a tit-for-tat response. So Putin said Sunday that Russia has a sufficient supply of cluster munitions to use if Ukraine employs the controversial weapons. The U.S. has started shipping cluster bombs to Ukraine, even though the weapons are notorious for killing and maiming civilians. And U.S. cluster munitions have already arrived in Ukraine. I haven't seen any reports yet that they've been in use. So we know, Human Rights Watch has said that both sides have used cluster bombs in the war, and there's other groups and evidence of cluster bomb use on both sides. Although Putin is claiming that Russia hasn't used them, and just from what I've seen, it doesn't. It seems like they have used them, but not at the scale that they might now. That Ukraine is planning to with all this artillery. These hundreds of thousands of shells that they're getting. So what basically is Putin is saying is that they're gonna, if Ukraine starts firing all these artillery cluster munitions, Russia is going to do the same thing, and it's just going to be increase the number of, you have all these mines that Russia planted, and Ukraine has also planted mines, and now, there's been cluster bombs, but now there's just going to be way more. It's very clear that that's going to be the result of the U.S. sending these over there. Russia's going to start using them way more as well. So Putin said, quote, Russia has a sufficient reserve of various kinds of cluster munitions. So far, we have not done it. We have not used them, and we have not had such a need, despite a certain shortage in munitions at a certain point of time. But we didn't do this. But of course, if they are used against us, we will reserve the right to tit-for-tat actions, end quote. So Putin also noted that the White House said last year that the use of cluster bombs in Ukraine would be a potential war crime. That was just a few days after Russia invaded. That was Jen Psaki, the former White House press secretary, who now has her own show on MSNBC. She was asked about these reports that Russia used cluster munitions, and she said, well, if that's true, that would be a potential war crime. But now the U.S. is participating in a war crime. So Putin said, quote, as for cluster munitions, the U.S. administration itself gave its opinion on these munitions a while ago when the use of cluster munitions was called a crime. So I think that is how it should be treated, end quote. So the U.S. is sending Ukraine cluster bombs in the form of 155 millimeter artillery shells. And, the provision means that both sides might engage in heavy artillery battles, as this war is a heavy artillery war. And now, with lots of cluster munitions could be flying around. And we know, they're so dangerous. I know I've covered this a lot because they spread these small submunitions around large areas, and a lot of them don't explode. And civilians can come across them years or decades later, as we see in Laos and Vietnam and Cambodia. So the shells that the U.S. is providing, they say they're going to give them hundreds of thousands. I think it could go up to millions. But these shells, each one is packed with 72 of these submunitions. And according to the New York Times, the shells are expected to have a 14% dud rate. So that means about 10 of these submunitions per artillery shell won't explode. So that's, how many is that? 100,000 shells used. They each leave 10 behind. That's a million right there. So it's just going to be a huge hazard, a huge cleanup that they're going to have to do. But they're doing it. All right, the next one here. Wagner fighters train soldiers in Belarus. So Belarus announced Friday that members of the Wagner mercenary force were in the country training Belarusian soldiers. The Belarusian Defense Ministry said that the Wagner members were training them on, different types of things. And at this point, it's not clear how many of the mercenaries decided to go to Belarus. They didn't say how many of them were there. The ministry said in a statement that it reached a deal with Wagner, quote, for the near future for training and transfer of experience between units of different branches of the armed forces, end quote. So under the deal that put down Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin's short-lived mutiny, Wagner members were given the option of going to Belarus. When the agreement was first reached, it seemed like Prigozhin agreed to go live in exile in Belarus, but he has since returned to Russia. It's not clear where he is right now, but he went to Belarus and then he went back to Russia, including for a June 29th meeting with Putin at the Kremlin. Moscow has shared little detail about the Putin-Prigozhin meeting, which also involved Wagner commanders. Putin was talking a little bit about it in a recent interview that was published. He said that the Wagner fighters could continue operating in Ukraine under the leadership of their battlefield commander, which is not Prigozhin, under kind of the highest ranking battlefield guy. But apparently Prigozhin said no, and Putin said in this interview that when he offered this, he said he saw the other Wagner commanders nodding and agreeing, and then that Prigozhin said no, they wouldn't agree to this. So it's kind of strange. I don't know what the situation is with Prigozhin, what's going to become of him or all the Wagner fighters. It's all kind of not clear at this point, but at least some of them are in Belarus, training Belarusian soldiers. All right, the next one here, U.S. reservists to provide administrative support. So the White House said Friday that the 3,000 reservists President Biden has made available for the Pentagon to deploy to Europe would serve administrative functions. So this is White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby. He said, quote, "These are people that are specialists in things like administrative functions, logistics, supply, maybe medical, dental, those kind of things. The kind of enabling functions that you need to support and sustain a large troop presence for a long time." End quote. So President Biden signed the executive order to support what they call Operation Atlantic Resolve, which is the name for U.S. military operations in Europe that are a response to events in Ukraine. This mission was first established in 2014 after the U.S.-backed ousting of former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, which led to Russia annexing Crimea and the civil war in the Donbass region. Since February 2022, the U.S. has deployed over 20,000 additional troops to Europe. So there's over 100 U.S. That brings it to over 100,000 U.S. troops in Europe. And, by signing this executive order, giving the Pentagon the ability to send 3,000 reservists over there, it shows that the U.S. military is strained trying to maintain this large troop presence in Europe. And again, it's concerning when you think about if things really heat up and the U.S. wants to send a few 100,000 more to Europe or to Southeast Asia or wherever, that they're going to mobilize a lot of reservists and maybe they're going to think about a draft. So out of these 3,000 reservists, up to 450 people could be pulled from what is known as the Individual Ready Reserve, the IIR. So people in the IRR, sorry, it's IRR. They've previously served active duty, but they have a reserve commitment. So essentially, a lot of people, say they enlist out of high school for 4 years. They sign an 8-year contract, so they do 4 years active duty, and then they could do 4 years of this IRR. And it's different than, say being in the Army Reserves and going and doing like a week, service every weekend and like a 2-week thing every year. So they're essentially civilians. They're living as civilians. They don't have uniforms or anything. And, a lot of these people, from friends that I know that have been in the military in that period, you're, done, it's behind you and you're done with it. So getting that phone call, I'm sure these people aren't going to be happy about that. But President Biden's order came after he was in Europe for a NATO summit in Lithuania. And, there they vowed to further, build up what they call their eastern flank, which is all these countries that border Russia and Ukraine. And this, these 20,000 troops that they sent, most of them are in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Romania, Latvia, Lithuania, and they do want to establish a presence in Finland now, and of course, Sweden as well when they formally join. All right, so the next one here, Indonesia warns that the ASEAN cannot be a proxy. So Indonesian President Joko Widodo warned on Friday that the members of the Association of the Southeast Asian Nations, that's the ASEAN, can't be a proxy for any country as tensions between the U.S. and China are soaring in the region. So Widodo said at the summit, quote, "ASEAN cannot be a competition. It can't be a proxy of any country, and international law should be respected consistently," end quote. So this summit, what's interesting, it was attended by Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and Wang Yi, who's the head of China's Communist Party's Central Commission for Foreign Affairs. He's considered their top diplomat, different than the foreign minister. I think more comparable to like national security advisor. So he's saying this, to these guys that are attending. And Widodo said, quote, "We in ASEAN are committed to strengthening the unity and solidity as well as centrality in ASEAN to guard the peace and stability in the region," end quote. And he said things like this before, and I like to highlight this because a lot of these Southeast Asian countries, I know Singapore has been warning against this a lot, Indonesia. And they don't want to be caught in the middle between the U.S. and China. You have the Philippines, who's way more aligned with the U.S., obviously, because they're a treaty ally and they're allowing them to build these new bases and everything. But most of these countries really are not happy about what's happening between, with the U.S. the U.S. is basically trying to recruit them against China. And then, China is starting to do the same. And some countries are leaning more toward China, like Cambodia. The U.S. was trying to sanction them out of building a security relationship with China, but that backfired. And before Blinken went to this summit in Indonesia, this ASEAN summit, the State Department officials said that the U.S. was trying to work with these countries to push back against China. So it's explicitly what this is all about. But also, while Blinken was there, he met with Wang, the Chinese official, and they held talks. And the U.S. is, again, framing this engagement with Chinese officials. They call it, this is to manage our competition, to make sure things don't spiral out of control. It's not about really resolving issues, as they're continuing kind of to ramp up the economic campaign against China, as well as, things with Taiwan and just the overall buildup in the region. All right. The next one here, the U.S. is sending more F-16s to the Middle East. So this is another one from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute. And this is something the U.S. is saying that they're doing in response to Iran. They're saying they need to send F-16s to the region to prevent them from seizing ships. So Washington announced a plan to deploy additional fighter jets to the Middle East to prevent Iran from seizing ships in the Persian Gulf. The Pentagon is additionally evaluating proposals to send more military equipment into the region to address Russian aircraft operating in Syrian skies. I don't know what F-16s are going to do to prevent Iran from doing things on their own coasts. It's kind of strange. But according to AP, a defense official told reporters that the U.S. would deploy F-16s. The official said that the aircraft would provide cover to vessels traveling in the region. The U.S. seized a ship carrying Iranian oil to China in April, and that basically kicked off a new tanker war, as Kyle put it. Iran seized 2 ships after that, and in response, the U.S. said that it increased the number of patrols and personnel in the Persian Gulf. So the U.S., they seize a tanker, Iran seizes 2 tankers, and the U.S. increases its military presence there. And so tensions are just still pretty high between the U.S. and Iran. And I haven't seen a sign that, that deal that we were hearing about, those indirect talks that the U.S. and Iran were holding, seems like the progress on that has stopped. I just haven't heard anything about it. So tensions are still pretty high there. All right, the last one here, the U.S., South Korea, and Japan hold joint military exercises after North Korea test fired an ICBM. So this is another one from the Libertarian Institute. This is from Connor Freeman. So Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo held joint naval drills testing missile defense in international waters between Japan and South Korea on Sunday, following Pyongyang's latest intercontinental ballistic missile launch. This is interesting. An envoy from North Korea spoke before the UN Security Council. I think that was on Friday. He defended his government's actions as a response to various military provocations by Washington and its allies. It's pretty rare that the North Korean official would do that, defend these missile tests. So South Korea's Navy portrayed Sunday's drills as an opportunity to improve security cooperation with Japan, as well as the United States, in the face of North Korea's nuclear and missile threats. So this is another thing. South Korea and Japan, the U.S., the Biden administration has been trying to foster more cooperation there. And, of course, historically, they have a lot of, animosity between them. And they've been kind of trying to get them to cooperate more militarily. And I think it's been successful. They've signed some deals. And so to see them doing joint drills, this is, again, not just a message to North Korea, but also to China. All of this is kind of really about China, the U.S. giving Yoon, the South Korean president, basically whatever he wants. So, it's an excuse for the U.S. to build up on the Korean Peninsula, which is very close to China. And, coming soon, we're not sure exactly when it's going to happen. The U.S. is sending a nuclear-armed submarine to dock in South Korea, which is just a provocation for the sake of provocations. And, who knows what North Korea is going to do in response to that. we don't know. They keep saying that, they're probably going to do, another nuclear weapons test. And basically they're just going to, make that come true if they keep up with these provocations. The U.S. is always sending bombers there now. But yeah, the nuke, docking nukes in South Korea, huge provocation. It'll be the first time in decades that U.S. nuclear weapons are there. But that's it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from David Stockman, Villainy in Vilnius, one from Ted Snyder at the Libertarian Institute. Was no NATO expansion east more than a promise? We have one from Ramsey Baroud. Jenin is just the start. Did Palestinians finally bury the ghosts of the past? One from Ivan Eland, the GOP's Wilsonian Mexico policy. That's over at the Independent Institute. And one from Seymour Hirsch, Gitmo's Permanent Chains. That's from his Substack, reprinted on SheerPost. So go check all that out. That's it for me. I hope everybody had a good weekend. You could help us out at antiwar.com/donate anytime. Like and subscribe on YouTube. Keep leaving comments. Keep giving me your feedback. Let me know what you think about all this craziness that's going on. But I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.